Hello, hello, my PSG friends. This is Red and Blue, your channel on PSG in English on YouTube. Please subscribe. Today, I want to talk about Luis Campos, who gave a long 1 hour plus interview to a French radio called RMC, which is the main sports radio talk shows and so on about footballs. They've got huge listenership in France. And he went into a show which is actually hosted by a former PSG player, Jérôme Roten, if you remember, from like the 2000s, was a left winger with a beautiful left foot. He was actually part of the Monaco crew that went to the final of the Champions League against Porto, the Porto of Jose Mourinho back in the days. And yes, and went on to play with us for years and years. Now he's got a radio show, and he was interviewing Luis Campos with a few other journalists, including former French international player Christophe Dugarry, former Marseille player Eric Dimeco, and a couple of other journalists. And they did an hour-long session with Luis Campos. Talked about a broad array of things, which was quite interesting, I guess. They talk about a few things, and we can go into details. I guess I'll try to do it chronologically because I think it makes a lot of sense. I think the earliest things that they talked about was how Luis Campos recruited Luis Enrique. And they touched on that. Luis Campos mentioned that they had, a team around him that were scouting the coach market, looking at different options, and that ultimately, Luis Campos had a meeting with Luis Enrique at Luis Enrique's home, I think in Spain, I assume, back in the days. And straight away, very early in the conversation, both of them understood that the fit was right and that they were going to be working together. And that's when, they started redefining what the PSG project should look like, putting the team above all, and getting rid of some of the individuals. Following up on this, Luis Campos says that it is Luis Enrique who had the tough conversation with Neymar, and told Neymar that his time at PSG was going to be ending, and that it was better, quote unquote, better for him to look for another club because he wasn't going to be playing anymore. Which, I can't imagine, there would have been a very easy conversation for Luis Enrique, but kudos to him for having it, and really sticking to his gun in terms of, moving past the superstar era of PSG, and moving into one where the team was going to be the strongest. Following up on this, Luis Campos also talked about obviously last season in very broad term in terms of the history of it all, of how great they did and so on. He talks about when Luis Campos extended his contract, which was at the very end of last season, and there were a lot of rumors because the extension took a long time to get finalized, and so there were a lot of rumors that Luis Campos wasn't so sure, that he was asking a lot of money. Ultimately, he got a contract extension with more responsibilities of looking at after all of the Qatari football investments rather than just PSG. And he talked about this, and he was saying that at his age, he thought about it hard and long. He talked about it with his family, that he wants to spend time with them, that for him PSG is the last project that he's going to be part of, and that he also considered whether PSG was giving him the guarantees and the right answer in terms of where the project was going, having the resources for it, and so on and so forth. And he also mentioned that last season we had a bunch of contract extension, and so that he kind of voluntarily left himself at the end of that and dealt with all of the players first. There was Hakimi, there was Vitinha, there was the coach as well, got a contract extension. Nuno Mendes got a contract. So a lot of players went through that process, and Luis Campos left himself for last. Which, you can believe or not believe, but essentially that's the answer that he gave. And I think that conversation of contract extension actually flows nicely into the answer that he gave on Donnarumma. That was one of the first questions that was asked of him. And I think, the journalists were very not super pushy on this one. I think they were more pushy on a few other topics. But yeah, they really wanted to understand. And I actually have the quote in here. So what he said, and I'm reading the quote, which I got translated. He said, the club's policy is to build a team. The club is more important than any individual. That has changed as PSG. Donnarumma's departure was a result of a set of circumstances when he asked for a salary at the level of the old PSG, not the current PSG. Our policy is very tied to merit. You earn more when you deserve it. We took time to discuss Gigio's situation. We had to find solutions if we couldn't reach an agreement. At first, it was hard to understand Donnarumma's demands. He was the first player we opened renewal talks with, but we quickly realized it would be difficult. The coach then said maybe he could take advantage of it to make the team stronger with the ball. When we can make PSG more French, we'll do it. This is nothing new. If there's a good player who fits our team profile, we'll try to make it happen. End quote. There's a few things in there which I thought were mildly interesting. First, the fact that they opened talks with Donnarumma very early on. Because there's this kind of temporality that people have been talking about, in which even if the club did offer him a new contract, they offered him at such a low rate that they made it impossible for Donnarumma to accept from the get-go, and they always wanted to go get Chevalier. This very much doesn't sound like it from what Luis Campos is saying, and them getting Chevalier is essentially trying to make the best out of a bad situation. Once again, you can believe or not believe, but I think, having listened to the interview and the way he was talking about it, it did sound pretty natural in his answer, and pretty if not real, then at least very well rehearsed, I would say. And yeah, I mean, it does fit with something that we know about Donnarumma, which is sadly he's a player who's known to ask for a lot in contract negotiations. That was the case with AC Milan when he left them. That was the case with us when he came to PSG. That was the case in this contract negotiation. And ultimately, now in Man City, it sounds like he got a very, very good deal out of them as well. So, not blaming it for it. Obviously, completely fair play, and he's in his rights. But the club is also in its right to have a policy and kind of hold himself to it. So that's kind of the takeaways, from it. Then the conversation moved into this summer mercato, and that's where the journalist squad got a lot more pushy with him, essentially saying that PSG did not do enough business in this window, and that they should have anticipated the injuries a lot more, that they should have gotten a cover for Hakimi in particular. That was a point of discussion that came back. And I think, Luis Campos, in his defense, he gave the answers that he has to give, that the club has been giving. He didn't really bring anything new to the table fundamentally. What he said, and I think people are free to disagree, but you've got to recognize the point of view. He said we have zero regrets. We did what we thought we should do. The coach didn't want a larger squad, ? Yes, of course. Throughout my career, I've always listened to my coaches. It's one of the secrets of my success. Luis Enrique explained how he wants the team structured. He wanted a central defender with certain characteristics and a new goalkeeper. PSG style of play is difficult for opponents to understand. That makes it easier for us to win matches. And that last part of the quote, PSG style of play being difficult for opponents to understand, that was a big part of the answer that he gave, especially on the Hakimi question, because journalists were saying oh, you don't have any player who can replace Hakimi for and who's got similar characteristics to Hakimi. And Luis Campos goes, look, like, Warren Zaire-Emery and Joao Neves, when they play in this position, they bring something different to the table, and it makes it very hard for opponents to understand, because all of a sudden, like, those players, they drift in field versus staying on the right if it's Hakimi, player of move. If it's not Hakimi, then Nuno Mendes on the other side can move forward a lot more. And so there's different set of balances which go beyond just finding a like-for-like replacement for a given player. And I think, it's very telling, and it's just like it ties back into how we know Luis Enrique is looking at his squad and looking at his team. And so, yeah, at the end of days, like, you can disagree with it, and there's still plenty of people out there who say, like, oh, we should have recruited a right back to that can cover for Hakimi when we need him to. But yeah, that's not the view of Luis Enrique. That's not the view of Luis Campos. Both of them clearly work very closely together. Both of them agreed on this. And so that's the decision that they took. And I think, they talk about Zabarni coming on board. And it's kind of interesting, like this part of the quote as well, when he's saying, like, Luis Enrique wanted a central defender with certain characteristics. And when he goes into more detail, he's saying, like, oh, we've seen, like, how English team play, the fast pace of it, the physicality of it. And so we felt like we needed an additional defender who could speak to this evolution of the game and the way the English teams are going. And, if you look at our Champions League run last season, we faced and we beat English team after English team after English team after English team, and ultimately even faced another one in the Club World Cup. So it's fair to say that if we want to keep winning in the Champions League, and if we want to stay at the top of European football, we have got to think of how you can beat those teams who are, like, by default, like, coming out of the best league in Europe right now. And so it makes sense that in the context of how we're building the squad, this is the tactical challenge and the football challenge that Luis Enrique and Luis Campos would seek to answer. And yeah, like I said, like, he got challenged a few times. The conversation actually moved on into, like, players' calendar / physical fitness / injuries and what happened with the French national team. I'll read the quote, like, specifically on the French national team. It's good for everyone if we communicate more. I know UEFA is working on this, but it's not just a problem in France, it's an evolution. Dembélé showed signs of fatigue, and we communicated that to the FFF, the French Federation. In the future, we must communicate more for the good of the players and football. If we have more discussions about recovery, fatigue, or workload, it's easier for everyone to make decisions. If we share information, everyone benefits, PSG, the players, the federation, it's very important. We informed the federation that Dembélé was at risk of injury. We want to find the best solution for everyone, because PSG loses its player for several weeks, but so does the French national team. We must protect players by sharing information among everyone. So, not in itself a groundbreaking answer. I think when it came to the conversation with the French national team, he got a lot of pushback, because there is this idea among French journalists and among, like, French football fans in general, that there's also responsibility to be laid at the feet of the club, PSG, and the player. And that's essentially what they were trying to say. They were trying to say, like, yeah, you asked the French national team not to play Dembélé, but you also played him against Toulouse the game just before, and he was already tired, and he was probably already at risk of injury. And so why did you play him in that context? And then you turn around and ask the French national team not to play him. Which is, like, I feel it's not an entirely fair point to make, because, like, and, Luis Campos, like, kind of laughed and said, like, because, he's important to us, and so we have to play him as well, which I thought was a completely fair answer. And also, like, what he didn't say is that we're the ones who are paying his salary. And so, it's a business, ultimately, like, that's the way it goes. We're the ones who are paying for his salary, so we should be first in line to get the benefits out of the player. And yes, like, in sports, national team competition can take a very special place. And I think in France in general, we tend to look at the French national team as the pinnacle and like really like what should be at the top of the food chain. But if PSG is playing the salary, it's not necessarily the way it should be. And ultimately, like, you know, the fact is that yeah, like both sides have to communicate better and have to work together better so that the players can have the like stay healthy, which is really like the main thing, and play in as many games as possible. And another thing which he gave, and that was more like the broader answer about like injury risks this season, and you know, like should you have recruited more because it's so obvious that we're gonna get injuries. I find like a little bit silly. His answer is that, you know, also like the staff is incredible at managing the players. We didn't have any injuries last year, and it was not like just blind luck, which, you know, a lot of people seem to believe. We played 65 games last season, and like it was not blind luck that our players managed to get through them. And we have, you know, world-class staff and probably best in the world facility for training and recuperation with the campus, which is something I've mentioned before. And so in that context, like, you know, it's no surprise, and like that's why also like the French national team needs to be listening and willing to communicate with the club, because the club has this wealth of data and knowledge and medical resources that the national team doesn't necessarily have. At least like all of the ongoing data, they wouldn't have that. And so there's value in that communication for them as well. And yeah, in terms of, you know, injuries and so on, it's like it's hard to say bad luck when we're dismissing the fact that no injuries last season was good luck. But yeah, at the same time, like they made the choice. They built the answer that he gives, that they built a squad where players can be versatile and play in different positions in different ways, and that's the way of in which they gain an advantage against opponents. He also talked about like how those injuries are an opportunity for other players to show themselves, how they've got a lot more youngsters coming out of the academy and want to have more. He talked about how in general, like there's more and more young player and young kids who identify with PSG and want to play with PSG, and that makes it easier for us in the long run. And so all of this, you know, kind of plays into it. He talked about our finances in terms of, you know, our finances are strong, and yeah, if there's opportunities in January or next summer, quote unquote, we can make the right signings, well thought through with the coach and the president. And that's kind of, you know, at the core of what he says. You know, we're smart, we're like working together, we're not making rash decisions, we think long term, and you know, today, like, we've got the money for it if we need, and if there's the right player at the right price, we'll go for it. And finally, like the last point that I wanted to cover is about the Ballon d'Or. The trophy is going to be ended. The ceremony is the beginning of next week, so it's coming soon. He says, like, first, PSG has 9 Ballon d'Or nominees. We're very happy and proud of that. Other players also deserve to be there, like Barcola or Pacho. But ultimately, like, he goes and talked about Dembélé for a while. He says Ousmane Dembélé scored 35 goals and delivered 16 assists. He was named best player of the Champions League, best player of his league. He finished as top scorer of his league. He won everything. If his name were Leo Messi or Cristiano Ronaldo, there would be no debate. It's completely fair, I think. And he said, like, if he doesn't win the Ballon d'Or, it's because the people voting don't have the competence to vote for it. Because his stats and everything he has won are incredibly strong. In my opinion, the one who clearly deserves the Ballon d'Or is Ousmane Dembélé. For me, there's no debate. And it's kind of funny because he goes on, by the way, he talks also about, like, Hakimi and Vitinha having amazing seasons, but still say that for him, yeah, Dembélé is the one. And yeah, it's funny because the journalist actually pushed him on Yamal, and Eric Dimeco, I think, who asked the question, and he's like, former Marseille player. He's like, yeah, for me, I think that Yamal, should win the Ballon d'Or because, he's had the better season, because when you see the games that he's had against Real Madrid and Inter, clearly he's above Dembélé, and I don't like when you say that people who think otherwise don't know football and so on. And I think it was another journalist came back at him and went yeah, but that's the point. You're talking about 4 games. He didn't have the look at the statistics. He didn't have the better season than Dembele. Yeah, no, but I think that I don't like that you say people don't know about this, and he went on a whole thing. It's yeah, man, you just don't want a PSG player to win it. At least come out and say that. You can say that Yamal is a better player in absolute terms, but it's very, very, very hard to argue that Yamal had a better season last season than Dembele. Maybe he can play better at the peak of his game on some specific games. Maybe he's going to grow to be a better footballer than Dembele. I can definitely agree with that. But when you look at last season, when you look at the individual performances, the stats, the team results, and the impact on the team, yeah, I mean, really, really hard to say that that Dembele doesn't win it in that context. Luckily, all of that is going to be solved in a matter of less than a week now. So all of that can be put to bed with hopefully a nice Dembele win. So anyway, that's kind of all of the key points that came out of this interview, this Luis Campos hour unleashed of going through everything. Quite a few interesting tidbits here and there would be what I thought ultimately. Nothing earth-shattering, but I wasn't really expecting that. But yeah, let me know what you think. If any of it caught your ear, and if there's anything specific that surprised you or that you thought was particularly interesting. As always, please drop a like on this video. Please subscribe to the channel. Please hit the bell to get notified of future videos. And don't forget, on Radio or Not, ici c'est Paris!